Hey everyone, so this video is a little bit different for me. There will be only a little bit of a tutorial in this, so basically just a couple tips. This is mainly more of a wish list, and who knows if Unity will ever add these things. They haven't added them up to this point, and some of these are very common game features, and it really just surprises me that Unity still doesn't support them. Some of them, there are packages you can buy. Some of them, there is manual workarounds. But I just want to cover these because I've been complaining more in my tutorial videos, and I don't think that's fair to you guys. I think it's a distraction. As it is, learning some of this stuff can be challenging enough. You don't need to hear me complain. So I'm going to put my thoughts into one video here, and hopefully that will make my other videos a little bit more clean and straightforward without me going off on a tangent or a rant. Okay, and these are in no particular order, and most of them are meant to benefit new users. So first of all, if you go up to Game Object and you go to 3D Object, you have a very, very limited amount of primitives. So you have cube, sphere, capsule, cylinder, plane, and quad. They could easily do another dozen or even 2 dozen shapes that could readily be used by new users for prototyping, proof of concept, that kind of thing. Yes, you could indeed download Pro Builder, but A, the new user would have to know that Pro Builder even exists, and B, then they have to learn the Pro Builder interface. And while I do like Pro Builder, I've had weird things happen with Pro Builder. So I'd like them to just add more primitives, again, in consideration of the new user for the prototyping. Now, obviously, more experienced users who have been programming for a while, they probably have a library that they can draw on. But again, that new user would not have that library in all likelihood. So more primitive shapes built in is the first recommendation. Second one, having the ability to transition to and from a color or a full screen image. This is something that games have done for years. I think even the original 8-bit NES had like a rudimentary screen fade. I think they just changed like the color of every pixel to like a darker shade until the whole screen was black. So this is something that's been around for years, and to the best of my knowledge, there's no built-in way to do it. I don't know if there's any screen fade on the Unity store. I don't think I've seen one. It's highly specific, but there might be something out there. But anyways, there's a manual way you can do this, and there's lots of manual ways you could do this. One of the simplest ones that if you have a UI, so you have a canvas, you can add a full screen image that's either a solid color or some pattern. And what you do is when you want the scene to fade to that image, to fade to black because you want to load in the next scene, you would simply have a script on that image, and it would change the opacity from 0 to 100%. And likewise, when you want to fade from black into the next image, that scene would also have, again, the image on the canvas, and you would fade from 100% opacity to 0% opacity. And again, I'm sure there's many ways to do this. This is probably the simplest one that I could think of. Feel free to put a better one in the comments. I'm never ever going to say what I do is the best, simply a way to do it and a fairly simple way to do it. Now, what would my wish be? My wish is that it would be built right into the camera because I figured that would probably be the component that would be easiest to make this happen with. And what you would do is you just have a couple checkbox, one that says fade in, one that says fade out. If you check it, you get 2 more options. One, what's the amount of time that you want the fade to occur? So 1, 2, 3 seconds. And do you want it fade to and from a solid color or an image? So kind of like how right now when you make a material, you can designate a solid color or you can add an image. Same kind of thing. So that's what I'd recommend, is that it would be built into the camera component. And again, those check marks with those options. Okay, so more primitives, built-in fade, similar to the built-in fade, and this might actually wrap in to the next one, would be a load scene, a load screen. Okay, so right now, to the best of my knowledge, there's no built-in load screen. There are indeed packages you can purchase off the Unity store. I purchased one, I believe, as part of a bundle. And the problem with that is the loading bar used an arbitrary timer. In other words, it didn't actually check to see how many of the assets had loaded. So in other words, it just said, fill up the loading bar in over 10 seconds or something. So as computers get faster and faster, that loading would be less and less meaningful. And again, you're really not giving the end user any kind of information. You're just arbitrarily filling up a bar. So what would my solution be? My solution would be to create a new type of scene built into Unity. So right now you can go to File, you can go to New Scene, and if you're in HDRP, it gives you like an indoor and outdoor option. I would say there'd be a third option, and it would be a load scene option, and it would have the built-in functionality of maybe you could even handle the transition in and out that we just described about. So transition to an image, out of an image, and that it would actually measure what's been loaded and update the loading bar accordingly. Okay, next one, post-processing. I'm going to be very brief because I've mentioned this one a few times now. For whatever reason, when you're using the standard rendering pipeline, so just a regular default project, you're not using HDRP, you're not using URP, post-processing is not built in for some reason. I don't know if it's because they're planning on deprecating it. I don't know, but for some reason, post-processing is still not built in to a 3D project. So you would have to download the package. So what that means, again, the new user would have to know that there's something called post-processing, and then they have to add the post-processing components and then do a few other things. So if I had my way, post-processing would be built into the standard rendered pipeline. And then again, with the camera, what would happen is when you create a camera object, by default, it would have those two post-processing components already attached, perhaps even have a layer name created for post-processing, which you would then link here. It would make life so much easier. And then the last thing that I want to mention, again, specific to Unity, is the rigid body. So when you have an object, a little robot guy here, if you've added a rigid body, now in the case of this character, it's going to be controlled by user input. But what if you have something that's in the background, like an asteroid, and you want it to be moving and rotating as soon as it spawns? Well, you can't do that right in the inspector. And I don't understand why. Why not just have a field that says velocity and a field that says angle of velocity? If you leave it to the default 0, fine. It doesn't have any velocity or angle of velocity, which is what happens right now. But if you put numbers in it, you've saved the user the trouble of making yet another script. Now, I was able to standardize it because what happens is that you can create a script and you can put two public variables. So since they're public variables, they'd be accessible in the inspector. And then you have two lines of code where you address the rigid body and you apply the values that are put into those two vector threes. So you have two public vector threes, two lines of code that affects the rigid body, one for velocity, one for angle of velocity. If you leave everything to default 0, fine, nothing happens. If you put a number in, great. Now you have your velocity and or angle of velocity. The only problem is since it's a script, it wouldn't show up here in the rigid body. It would show down here in the script that's doing it. So again, I think that's something that new users could really utilize, is having the velocity and angle of velocity baked right into the rigid body component. Now, I believe you might be able to serialize it, but that's something I know very little about. There's probably a good chance that Tech Dave knows how to do it. And if he does, if he shares that, that would be awesome. If he doesn't, no pressure. But for some of the components, you can serialize and you can make things exposed in the inspector that aren't normally there. So basically, you can customize the inspector. I messed around with it, couldn't get it to work. If someone else knows how to make it work, feel free to put in the comments. But yeah, so that is another potential solution, is to modify the inspector itself. But again, that's not something that a new user would know how to do and probably shouldn't do because they could mess things up. So I think that's about it. So we talked about more built-in 3D primitives. We talked about post-processing. We talked about having a load screen. We talked about having transition, fade in and out. And we talked about having the velocity and angular velocity exposed and modifiable right in the rigid body component in the inspector. So again, this is just a basic wish list. I have no doubt that absolutely no one at Unity actually watches my channel. I am basically a rounding error, which is fine. But who knows? Maybe Unity will eventually add these because, again, having such a bad experience as a new user, I'd like to see other people have a better experience. Okay, so that's about it. I hope that you found this useful, and please do enjoy the rest of your day.